Yeah, I'm going to sleep, but thanks though. Hey everyone, welcome to the Progress Campaign's Q&A series on our forecast model. We're going to give it just a minute for folks to join in. What we're going to do over the course of the next week or so is we're going to have, we hope to do this daily, but it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to squeeze the time. But what we're trying to do is give folks who visit our forecast model a behind the scenes, under the hood look of what's going on, and obviously answering a lot of questions. So we have about 90 questions or so from folks on social media, DM'd us on Twitter, and comments on different YouTube videos, and sent by email, which we're going to try to answer to try to give you a better understanding of how the model works. And later in the week, probably next week, we're going to be talking to Robert from Lean Tossup, is another excellent forecaster. And then later next week, we're going to talk to Pluralvote, which is another excellent forecaster. And hopefully, time permitting, we'll also talk to Jack from JHK Forecasts, another excellent forecaster. And obviously, I don't think there's much overlap between them, but just simply because we're a partisan organization, we weren't able to film the forecasting discussion segment with Elliot from The Economist forecast, but I don't know if there's any overlap between. I don't think if there are any of viewers over here who have not checked out The Economist forecast, you should go ahead and do that. Also follow Elliot on Twitter. He really gets out some premium knowledge on behind the scenes and how data is driving this election, and highly recommended. So we're going to give our data team another minute here to try to get these questions up. And yeah, pardon the background here. This is usually flipped around, and that's what we're looking at. And we'll try to get to questions here. Yeah, so we'll just dive right into it. We're also going to, over the course of this half hour, depending on how long we have, we're going to release a whole bunch of top lines of polls that we've conducted. Now, these are county level polls. We have not done any statewide polls. in the last couple of months. We will be doing one. I don't know if we publish this on social media. We are in the fields right now in Mississippi and Montana to gauge the Senate races there. There's been an extreme lack of polling, so we put a poll in the field. We also, we know that there's a lot of controversy around a 538 band. We will definitely get that sorted out after the election. We or 538 just don't have the resources to get that finished that process now, and to get a more oriented poll, contacted Survey USA, which hopefully can, on our behalf, send a poll into the field in Mississippi to gauge the Senate race there. I know it's definitely going to be interesting. We might do that on our own or start up a GoFundMe, like a lot of folks on election Twitter did. So if you're watching on Twitter and you think that's a good idea, you can leave a comment below and we'll get that started. So we could crowdfund another poll. Seems like it was narrowing for a while. We've done some county polling in Mississippi, which we might release here today, which definitely shows quite a tight race, especially in some of the big suburbs. So over the course of this, we're obviously going to be talking a lot about specific states, particularly Pennsylvania, Georgia, Texas. We've gotten a lot of questions about these states, so we're going to be releasing a lot of our tracker polls, our tracker county polls, which we've been doing over the course of the past couple of months. I think our first one was in April, all the way down to, I think, the last one we've done in Erie and Lackawanna County in Pennsylvania. It was Muskogee and Lowndes in Georgia, and a couple others in Ohio, which we'll get to over the course of these debates. So I'm going to start off here from a question from Dingers. I think a lot of folks on election Twitter know who he or she is. Pardon me, don't spend enough time to know the genders here. So he asked, or she asked, how much is your model based on polling versus registration data? So those are actually two separate models we run in our forecast. One is a turnout model, which determines how many folks are going to turn out in each individual precinct. And then we break that down by demographic. So that's where we use voter registration data, because we look at particularly voter registration data and then census data of how domestic migration, how interstate migration is looking, and then obviously how that translates into new voter registrations per precinct or per county. And that's one model we use to determine how many people are showing up in that individual precinct. And then the polling model is done to determine the voting intention. So the turnout model is telling us how many 18 to 29-year-olds are showing up, how many Hispanic Latino voters are showing up. And the polling model, what it says is we don't look at the top line of the polls, we look at the crosstabs. And we use polling to determine how those 18 to 29-year-olds, Hispanic Latino voters, African-American voters, women, et cetera, are voting. So that's a separate model that we put together. And then obviously we average all that data out and build it up into county and then into state projections. So when you look at, if you scroll down our forecast model, you can actually see that we do have polling at the bottom. And again, you can click on the link in each individual poll to see the crosstabs there. And that's the data we use for our voting intention model, is what we call it, how these folks are estimated to vote. And then you can also see that we do a county by county registration map on almost every state. Obviously, a lot of states don't have party registration or registration by race. So, and that's the separate one. So you can go down into the individual forecast pages and see that. Yeah, so Marcia asks, how come your forecast is so bullish on Texas and Georgia compared to other forecast models? So we've actually seen a lot of other forecast models catching up to us in the last couple of weeks, the last couple of days even. And we mostly think it's because like we said, we don't use pollsters' turnout models. We use the underlying data, so they weigh it by, there are a lot of different things that pollsters do, and they weigh that data, but they determine, they sort of make their own guesstimates about who's turning out. And since we use a lot of raw data and a lot of live data, we actually saw earlier on that we're expecting a lot more voters to show up, particularly in these big major urban areas, than what pollsters have seen. So if you look back, even in the polls in June or July, there isn't a lot of difference between the voting intentions of, say, Democrats or African American voters. There's some undecideds. There obviously was quite a bit of undecideds, but there wasn't this big shift from Trump to Biden. There simply were undecideds distributing according to what most people thought they were, but there were just simply more younger voters showing up, more voters showing up in the Houston, Dallas, and Austin metropolitan areas. And the same thing in Georgia, in the Atlanta metropolitan area as well. But I think what has pushed our forecast to detect this a little sooner than others was the fact that we were polling a lot of rural counties or relative rural counties. And we can talk a little bit about those two areas and those two polls. We have quite a bit of data from those. And we've actually seen that, if you look at both Stacey Abrams, but also Hillary Clinton, really lost a lot of rural support in the 2018 and then the 2016 elections relative to the 2012. And this is not just rural folks shifting from Democrat to Republican. These are just folks who didn't show up. So we have seen higher enthusiasm by the polling that we've done, and we've also seen better voting intentions. So hopefully we can get this on the screen as we talk about this. But so if we look at example at Lowndes, Georgia, which is Valdosta, Trump won it by 17 points, 57-40 in 2016. And right now, we, in our most latest poll, which was came out of the field on October 11th, Trump is leading 53-43, so by 10 points. So that's actually a 7-point swing compared to where it was in 2016. And Perdue is leading 51-42. And there's relatively low undecided voters at this point. There's 2% in the presidential race and 3% in the U.S. Senate race. So that's another indication that we're seeing that these relatively rural areas, but medium or even large towns in these rural areas are reverting back. So it's not just the big metropolitan Atlanta area, it's also these smaller and medium-sized towns across the state. And in Muskogee County, Georgia, which is a big chunk of Columbus, Clinton won there 57-39, so by 18 points in 2016. And right now Biden is leading 58-37, so by 21 points with only 2% undecided. And Ossoff is leading 56-36, again with only 2% undecided. So that's just an interesting element there, which we're seeing a 3 or 4 point shift from even 2016 in these rural areas, or these sort of medium or small sized towns, gives a very good indication of what's going to happen, because we already know that the Atlanta metropolitan area, there's going to be more folks showing up there, and they're going to be voting for Biden at a larger margin than they were in 2016 for Clinton. But we're also seeing these in the rural areas, and we've seen this all across the board, from Savannah and Augusta and Athens, all across the state. So, and the same thing in Texas. We're not gonna reveal any polls in Texas right now, simply because it's just such a close state, and we obviously share those with different organizations and campaigns on the state house level, which is extremely competitive right now. But we will have, hopefully after either after the election or on the day of the election, when it's no longer relevant, we can release all these polls in bulk and give election Twitter like a few hours of combing through stuff, waiting for results to come in. So that's why we're bullish on Texas and Georgia earlier on, simply because we saw earlier on that more folks were turning out in these big metropolitan areas, and that a lot of the rural areas, not just where there were folks who voted for Obama but then moved to Trump, but places where Democrats just stayed home because Clinton was just a pretty terrible rural American candidate. So next question is coming from Greg, and he asked, will the forecast reflect the registration deadlines and final numbers that passed in many states last week? This might be 2 weeks ago by the time we got to these Q&A series. So yes, all of the registration data, we actually have a pretty complicated process doing this, because we get registration data from organizations on the ground, and we use that as a placeholder before the secretaries of states release their official registration data, or before county officials release their official registration data. But yes, as we've seen, we've updated registration. We tried to do as much as we can once a day. It's pretty hard going fishing for all this different data and all these different county websites and state websites, and each state and county do it in a different way. But right now, the model reflects all the new registration data that we've seen. I think might be excluding North Carolina. We did have some issues there. The model had some issues there that might take a little longer to, that I do not think are currently reflected. So the North Carolina model is going to get updated sometime over the next day or two. JL, again, another election Twitter, North Carolina expert, asked, will you guys be going through your data after the election and analyzing what you got right and what you got wrong? Yes. Not only that, we hope to put together a largest as possible discussion panel along with Levine Toss-Up folks, the Jack from JHK Forecasts, and apologies, I'm forgetting the name of the guy who's behind the Plural Vote, and hopefully as well. I don't know if the Economist will let Elliot join that panel, and obviously there are a few other forecasters, or at least folks that work behind different forecasts. There's Chaz, who's in the CN analysis. There's a few others who are experts in different state models that they use. So yes, we're definitely going to do that. We have a big post-election processing that's going to go on for most of December, simultaneously to what we now expect to be the Georgia runoff season, the Senate runoff season. So we're definitely going to be putting together a lot of different data that you'll be able to see on the website as well about how we fared, obviously state by state and margins, which is the most important, but also on the county level. So we're obviously going to see, we might have, overshot on some counties and undershot on some counties to equal the right data. And there's nothing wrong with that in theory, but we're still going to put together an official, PDF document. We might release most of that if any data nerds want to get into that. But we're also going to have an interactive visual on the site that you'll be able to see. So second to last question here, Mitt is asking, how did your forecast fare in 2016? Did it give Clinton the win? No. This forecast model gave Trump the win. Clinton won Wisconsin and Michigan, I believe, but lost Pennsylvania, lost the rest of the states. I believe also lost New Hampshire, but I will have to double check that. But no, it gave Trump the win. This model, running with all the data that we can collect on the 2016 election, and there's a lot of live data we use. You can go up to our methodology. It's not something we're going to dive deeply into here. But it did give Donald Trump the win. But just as a caveat, is the model that I actually designed for the 2016 election, which was a very bare bones model, intended to. I was in the economics and financial world then. I did this pretty simple model relative to what our current one is, to sort of gauge what the financial implications of the election would be. And we did have, and it did have Hillary Clinton winning the 3 Midwestern states. She did not win Florida, North Carolina, or any one of those, but it did give her the win with, I believe 278 electoral votes. So the last question here is from Mark, and he asks, in recent weeks, Pennsylvania has seemed to go from a foregone conclusion for Biden to a very close election, with it counting votes well after Election Day. Do you see this being close, called on Election Day, or are we going to wait weeks for this state to be called? Well, we have enough data that it's very likely that we'll be able to call Pennsylvania on Election Day, simply because we just have so much data coming in about the number of voters and number of ballots that will be cast and mailed in, that we'll know, for example, how many ballots were cast in Philadelphia. So even if we can be conservative with those estimates, because most of the Philadelphia ballots are going to take a very long time to come in and be counted. We're still gonna have a better sense of what's going on. The tightening, we don't buy the tightening. A lot of that is from the fact that there are about 300,000 anti-establishment, economy-driven voters who show up in these big change elections for whoever the change candidate was, and in 2016 that was Donald Trump. But we don't see all of them showing up this time. We see only about half of them. So that's, I think, where you see the tightening happening, is because a lot of these pollsters are using 2016 level turnout on the Republican side, where there's just very little evidence in the data to suggest that all that spike in anti-establishment, economy-driven former industrial communities, coal miners, folks who have lost those jobs a long time ago, distanced themselves from politics, are actually going to show up in this election. So that's the short answer. The longer answer, and we'll talk here about this right now, is that it's not only about waiting for data from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia. It's also about the other ones. So obviously, as we're releasing right now, we have several tracker polls that we've been running in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin, obviously. But one of them is in Lackawanna County, which is Scranton, which is Biden's original hometown. And here, as you can see, we released a public poll on April 28th, which showed him leading 56-39. And again, Clinton won Lackawanna County 50-46, so by 4 points. And right now we're seeing him leading by 17. And obviously in May and June, we saw a dip in Biden's support as this pandemic took hold, and but since then he has definitely regained his footing. As you can see, in May and June he dipped, but then in July he was back up to 56%. And the most recent October poll puts him at 57%. Worth noting that Obama got 60 and 62% respectively in 2012 and 2008. Just for a frame of reference, and obviously after Trump climbed to 41.5%, he's back down in 39.5%. Not a lot of undecideds, again, about 1% of the vote. So you can see that. So the bottom line here is that, if Pennsylvania in 2016 was called with by 44,000 votes or 45,000 votes, even if we're waiting for what Philadelphia is going to do, and we might be waiting for a while, if we see places like Lackawanna County right now shifting back 15 points back over to Biden from where it was in Clinton, and Erie County, which we'll touch upon in a second, flying back as well, then that's going to be a pretty early indication that we're going to see that Pennsylvania is going to go to Biden, even if we see some lacklustrous numbers coming out of Philadelphia and its suburbs. So again, the same thing happened in Erie County, Pennsylvania. You can see in our tracker poll here in April that we released, it was 51-41, so he was leading by 10 points. Trump actually won here by 2 points, 48-46 in 2016. Obviously, as the pandemic and sort of economic issues persisted, that race tightened a bit into June, where Trump was only down by about 6 points, 49.5 to 43.5. But then in July, it was back up. But then in July, Biden was back up, and he continued his strength. And obviously in October, from September to October, we saw this relatively big jump for both candidates. Undecideds were distributed, and he leads by about 12 points, 11.5 points or so. So as you can see, again, a 13-point swing in Erie County, Pennsylvania, which means that, even if we're going to be waiting for Philadelphia, if Lackawanna and Erie County both come in and see this consistent 15-point swing in these bellwether counties, if you will, we're going to be able to call Pennsylvania pretty early, because it doesn't really matter what happens in Philadelphia unless you have 200,000 ballots which get tossed because of different issues. It's going to be extremely unlikely. So again, what may really end up happening is what I think Nathaniel Rakich on the 538 Politics podcast today or yesterday said, is that We might not be able to officially call the state of Pennsylvania on election day simply because we don't have a high degree of confidence that 100,000 ballots won't be thrown out in Philadelphia, or that 200,000 ballots won't. I mean, just because we don't know that, we might not be able to officially call it. But as we've seen from these tracking polls, if they do come to fruition, then if we do see 15-point swings in places like Scranton and Erie, we might not officially call Pennsylvania. We will not officially call Pennsylvania if there are hundreds of thousands of outstanding ballots from Philadelphia, but it will be an extremely uphill climb for Trump to overcome that, to the extent that we might even be able to see Biden leading the raw vote total in Pennsylvania on election day. And then we're going to be waiting for those ballots coming out of Philadelphia, which are going to skew 60-40, 70-30, 80-20 for Biden, which means that I do believe that most networks will be calling Pennsylvania on election day simply because of this. Obviously, we can be way off, and Trump can win Erie by a point. And that'll only be a 1-point swing in places like Erie, and maybe a 5 or 6 point swing in places like Scranton and Luzerne and all those other key areas which swung so heavily in 2016. But again, it's just extremely unlikely that happens. So thanks, y'all, for tuning in here for the first live series Q&A. This is going to be a relatively short one compared to other ones. We're obviously going to try to make it a little longer with the lean toss-up folks and the plural vote folks and JHK forecasts. Feel free to leave a comment here. I'm going to at least be online. I'll be able to answer questions on Twitter. If you have any more specific questions, just ask them below. I'll try to get to them, answering them right now. And if not, we'll save the rest for future live streams. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Mind, dear friends, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have to create a more perfect union.